He wasn't supposed to be covered in blood, not in a house this quiet, not beside a baby who was still breathing. And yet when Emily Carter pushed open the front door with her elbow, grocery bag slipping against her hip, that was the first thing she saw. The silence hit her before anything else, thick and unnatural, like the air had forgotten how to move. And then came the smell, faint but sharp, metallic, wrong, curling through the hallway and settling in the back of her throat as her heartbeat stuttered into something uneven and loud. "Noah," she called, her voice thinner than she expected, swallowed by the walls. And there was no answer, no soft cry from the nursery, no shuffle, no comforting noise that told her the world was still where she left it, just the quiet and that smell. And then she turned the corner and saw him, Rex, standing in the middle of the living room, still as a statue, his sable coat catching the dim afternoon light, his ears forward, his eyes locked on her with an intensity that made her stop mid-step. And there it was, dark against his fur, staining the edges of his muzzle, streaking faintly down his chest, something that should not have been there, something that did not belong in a home where a 6-month-old baby slept in a white crib with a soft blue blanket. The grocery bag slipped from her hand and hit the hardwood with a dull thud, an apple rolling slowly across the floor as if even it were unsure where to go. And Emily felt her breath hitch, her mind racing ahead of reason, filling the silence with images she could not control. And Rex did not move, not toward her, not away, just stood there watching, waiting, as if holding a line she could not see. "Where's Noah?" she whispered, the words barely forming. And Rex's ears twitched at the sound of the baby's name. A subtle shift, almost imperceptible, but enough to make her chest tighten further, because he didn't bark, didn't wag, didn't offer the familiar warmth she had reluctantly come to accept over the past months. He simply stood, and in that stillness Emily felt something break loose inside her, something primal, something protective and afraid, and she moved, fast now, past him, her shoulder brushing against the wall as she rushed toward the nursery, her pulse pounding in her ears so loudly it drowned out everything else. The door was slightly ajar, just an inch, the way she never left it, and her hand trembled as she pushed it open, the hinges giving a soft creak that sounded too loud in the quiet house. And for a fraction of a second, she couldn't bring herself to look inside, couldn't force her eyes to confirm what her mind had already begun to fear. And then she did, and the room was still, bathed in a soft gray light from the window, the curtain swaying just slightly from a draft she didn't remember leaving. And there, in the crib, Noah lay on his back, his tiny chest rising and falling in slow, steady rhythm, his fist curled near his cheek, asleep, untouched, the blue blanket still tucked around him exactly the way she had left it. Emily's knees nearly gave out, a rush of relief hitting her so hard it made her dizzy, and she staggered forward, gripping the edge of the crib, her eyes scanning every inch of her son, searching for anything out of place, any sign of harm, any reason for the smell that still lingered in the air. But there was nothing, no mark, no disturbance, just the quiet breathing of a child who had no idea how close fear had come to swallowing the room. Behind her, she could hear Rex's nails lightly touch the floor as he shifted his weight, a single step, hesitant, careful, and Emily turned, her relief colliding instantly with the image of him again, that dark stain against his fur, the question rising back up, sharper now, louder, because if not Noah, then what, and why, and how? And Rex's gaze met hers, unwavering, not pleading, not defensive, just steady, as if he understood something she did not, as if he had already made a choice long before she walked through that door. "What did you do?" she asked, the words trembling despite her effort to hold them firm. And Rex did not answer, could not. But his posture shifted slightly, his body angling just enough to reveal the hallway behind him, the open space beyond. And for the first time Emily noticed it, the faint scuff near the back door, the way it sat not fully closed, just slightly off its frame, letting in a thin line of late afternoon light that cut across the floor like a warning she had almost missed, and the air near it felt colder somehow, disturbed, as if something had passed through recently and left the house holding its breath in the aftermath. And Rex's eyes flicked once toward that door and back to her, a silent motion, small but deliberate. And in that moment, the fear inside Emily shifted, not gone, but changing shape, stretching into something deeper, something that carried a question she hadn't yet dared to ask. Because whatever had happened here while she was gone, whatever had filled this quiet house with that metallic scent and that heavy silence, it had not touched her son, and the only thing standing between that unknown and the crib was a dog who now stood covered in what she had first believed was guilt, but might have been something else entirely. Emily did not remember stepping away from the crib, but suddenly she was in the hallway again, her hand pressed flat against the wall, as if the house itself might steady her, her eyes locked on that back door where the thin blade of light cut across the floor, and the air there felt wrong, colder, as though something had slipped in and left the space unsettled. Rex moved only when she did, not rushing ahead, not circling, just staying close enough that she could hear the quiet rhythm of his breathing, slower now, heavier, and when she glanced down she noticed it for the first time, not just the dark stains on his fur, but the way his front leg did not quite bear weight the way it should, a subtle hesitation each time he shifted, something he tried to hide but could not fully mask. "Stay," she whispered, though she was not sure if the command was for him or for herself, and Rex obeyed instantly, lowering his body slightly, his eyes never leaving her as she reached for the door, her fingers trembling as they closed around the handle. It was not locked, it had not even been shut all the way, just resting there, careless, and that detail pressed into her mind with a quiet weight, because she always checked it, always made sure, always turned the latch until she heard the click, and yet now it stood ajar, as if someone else had decided that the boundary did not matter. She pulled it open slowly, the hinges whispering against the frame, and the late afternoon air spilled in, carrying the scent of dry leaves and distant pavement warmed by the sun, but underneath it lingered something else, faint but unmistakable. That same metallic note that had greeted her at the front of the house, only sharper here, fresher, the small porch. Beyond was empty, the wooden boards worn smooth from years of use. A pair of old boots tucked neatly by the side, exactly where she had left them that morning, but the screen door swayed just slightly, tapping once against its frame with a soft, hollow sound that echoed more loudly than it should have, and Emily stepped out, her bare feet meeting the cool surface of the wood, her eyes scanning the yard, the quiet street beyond, the neighboring houses that sat unchanged and indifferent under the fading light. Nothing moved, no voices carried, no cars passed, and yet the stillness did not feel peaceful. It felt paused, like a moment held too long before something revealed itself. Rex came to the threshold but did not cross it, his body stopping just inside, as if he had already gone far enough, as if whatever had happened had reached its end before she ever arrived, and Emily turned back to him, her fear now tangled with something else, something heavier, a realization beginning to form. In the spaces between what she saw and what she did not. "Did someone come in here?" she asked, her voice softer now, less accusation, more uncertainty, and Rex's ears shifted again, his gaze flicking briefly toward the far edge of the porch where the shadows gathered near the side of the house. And Emily followed that look, her steps slow, cautious, each movement measured as though the ground itself might give way if she rushed. There, near the corner where the siding met the steps, she noticed the faint disturbance, a scuff in the dust, not large, not dramatic, just enough to break the pattern that had settled over time, and beside it, something darker against the wood, a mark that matched the color she had seen on Rex, small, irregular, not splashed or scattered, but present, undeniable, and her breath caught again, not in panic this time, but in recognition that whatever had touched this space had not stayed long, had not lingered, had come and gone quickly, leaving behind only these quiet traces and the silence that followed. She straightened slowly, her gaze lifting back toward the yard, then beyond it, to the street, to the world that carried on without noticing the thin line that had been crossed inside her home. And for a moment she simply stood there, caught between the instinct to run, to call, to fill the silence with noise, and the deeper, quieter understanding that something had already been decided before she ever turned that handle, that a choice had been made in her absence, one she had not witnessed but was now beginning to feel in every detail around her. Behind her, Rex let out a low breath, not a growl, not a whine, just a release of air that carried fatigue more than anything else. And when she turned back to him, really looked this time, she saw it more clearly. The way his chest rose a little unevenly, the way his stance held tension even in stillness, the way his eyes, though steady, carried a weight she had never noticed before. Not fear, not aggression, but something closer to resolve, the quiet aftermath of a decision already made and carried through. Emily stepped back inside slowly, closing the door behind her, this time, making sure the latch caught, the click echoing in the hallway like a promise she wished she had kept earlier. And as the house settled again around her, she realized that the silence no longer felt empty. It felt earned, held together by something she had not understood when she first walked in. And as she looked from Rex to the hallway, to the crib just out of sight where her son still slept, the question that had once been sharp and accusing softened into something else entirely, something that no longer asked what he had done, but what he had prevented. The house seemed to exhale slowly as Emily stood there, her hand still resting on the door she had just locked, the quiet no longer empty but layered, like something unseen had passed through and left only its absence behind. And for the first time since she stepped inside, she allowed herself to listen not just with fear, but with attention. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant tick of the wall clock, the faint rustle of the curtains shifting in the breeze. All of it normal, all of it unchanged. And yet everything felt different because she knew now that something had happened here. Something she had not witnessed, but could still feel in the air like a memory that did not belong to her. Rex had not moved far from the hallway, his body lowering carefully onto the hardwood, as if the effort of simply standing had become too much. And when Emily took a step closer, slower this time, more deliberate, he did not retreat, did not tense. He simply watched her with those steady eyes that no longer felt like a challenge, but like an invitation to understand. She knelt beside him, hesitant at first, her hand hovering above his shoulder before finally making contact. And the warmth of his first startled her, grounding her in a way she had not expected, real and present and alive. And beneath her fingers she could feel the slight tremor of fatigue, the subtle tension that ran through his body even in rest. "You are hurt," she whispered, the words forming without accusation now, only recognition, and Rex's ears shifted faintly at the sound of her voice, his gaze softening just enough to reveal something deeper. Something that had been there all along, but she had never taken the time to see. She reached for a nearby cloth from the kitchen counter, her movements careful, almost reverent, as she returned and gently pressed it against the edge of his fur where the dark stain had dried unevenly. And he flinched, just once, not pulling away, not resisting, only reacting to the contact. And that small motion told her more than anything else had so far, because it was not the reaction of something guilty or wild, it was the reaction of something that had endured more than it could explain. "I am sorry," she said quietly, though she was not entirely sure what she was apologizing for. The fear, the doubt, the way she had looked at him when she first walked in. And as she spoke, she realized that the silence between them was no longer heavy. It was fragile, something that could be broken if she moved too quickly, if she returned to the panic that had ruled her only minutes before. From the nursery came a soft sound, a small shift in Noah's breathing that drew her attention instantly, and she turned her head, listening, waiting, and when no cry followed, only the steady rhythm of sleep, she felt a different kind of weight settle in her chest. Not fear this time, but gratitude, quiet and overwhelming, the kind that does not arrive with noise but with understanding. She looked back at Rex, really looked, taking in the details she had missed before, the faint line along his side where his fur lay uneven, the slight stiffness in his posture, the way his breathing carried a deeper effort now. And in that moment, the pieces began to align, not in a clear, perfect picture, but in a feeling, an instinct, that told her the truth did not need to be loud to be real. "You stayed," she murmured, her hand resting more firmly now against his shoulder, and Rex closed his eyes for a brief second, not in weakness, but in something that felt closer to relief, as if the tension he had carried since whatever had happened had finally begun to ease. The late afternoon light shifted through the windows, stretching longer across the floor, softening the edges of the room, and Emily became aware of how ordinary everything still looked, the couch exactly where it had always been, the blanket folded neatly over the armrest, the small toys scattered near the nursery door, untouched, undisturbed. And yet within that ordinary space, something extraordinary had unfolded without witness, without applause, without anyone to name it in the moment it occurred. She sat there for a long time, longer than she realized, her hand moving slowly over Rex's fur, cleaning what she could, not rushing, not questioning, simply being present in a way she had not been before. And in that quiet act, something shifted between them, not dramatic, not sudden, but steady, like a line being redrawn without words. When she finally stood, her legs stiff from kneeling, she glanced once more toward the nursery, then back to Rex, who now lay with his head resting against the floor, his breathing calmer, his body no longer holding the same tension. And she understood then that whatever had crossed the threshold of her home had not taken what mattered most, not because it had failed, but because something had stood in its way, something that did not need to speak to make a choice, something that had already decided long before she ever knew there was a reason to be afraid. The light outside had begun to fade into that quiet hour between late afternoon and evening, when shadows stretch longer than they should, and every sound seems to carry farther than it ought to. And inside the house, Emily moved with a new kind of awareness, slower, more deliberate, as if each step now held weight it had not carried before. She rinsed the cloth at the sink, watching the water swirl faintly darker before clearing again, her hands steady despite everything that had shifted inside her. And when she turned back, Rex had not moved far, still resting near the hallway, his body lowered, his presence constant, like a quiet anchor in a space that had almost slipped beyond her control. She walked back to him, kneeling once more, this time without hesitation, and continued to clean what she could, gently, carefully, mindful of every small reaction, every breath, every flick of his ears that told her where he felt it and where he endured it. "You do not have to stay strong right now," she murmured, her voice softer than it had ever been around him. And though he did not understand the words, something in her tone reached him, because his posture eased just slightly, the tension in his shoulders loosening in a way that felt like trust rather than surrender. The house remained quiet, but it was no longer the same silence. It was filled now with something earned, something held together by an unseen moment that had already passed, but had not yet fully revealed itself. And Emily found herself glancing again toward the back door, toward the line of light that had since dimmed, toward the space where something had entered and been stopped without her ever knowing until now. She stood and walked back to the nursery, pushing the door open with a gentleness that matched the breath she held as she stepped inside. And Noah was still there, still sleeping, his small chest rising and falling with that same steady rhythm, unaware of the thin line that had once separated him from something unknown, something that had come close enough to leave its trace in the air, but not close enough to reach him. She leaned over the crib, her fingers brushing lightly against his blanket, grounding herself in the warmth of his presence. And for a moment she closed her eyes, letting the quiet settle around her, letting the realization sink deeper, not as a sudden wave, but as a slow, steady understanding that what she had feared when she first walked in had not been the truth, and that the truth, whatever it fully was, had been standing in the hallway all along. When she stepped back out, Rex had shifted again, not moving away, but repositioning himself so that he faced both her and the nursery, his body angled in a way that felt intentional, as if even now, even in rest, he remained between her and the memory of what had happened. Emily noticed it this time, the way his instinct did not fade with the moment, the way it lingered, quiet and persistent, and something in her chest tightened again, not from fear, but from the weight of what she had nearly misunderstood. "You were watching him," she said softly, more to herself than to him. And the words felt different as they left her, no longer a question, but a realization spoken aloud. Rex's tail moved once against the floor, a small, tired motion, not the excited wag she had seen before, but something more restrained, more deliberate, as if even that small gesture carried effort now. Emily moved to the small cabinet near the kitchen and pulled out a basic first aid kit, something she had rarely used but kept out of habit. And as she returned, she found herself pausing for a moment, looking at him not as an obligation, not as a responsibility, but as something else entirely, something she had not allowed herself to see before. She knelt again, opening the kit, her hands moving carefully as she worked, cleaning, pressing, tending in quiet motions that mirrored the stillness of the house. And Rex remained still beneath her touch, his breathing steadying further with each passing minute, his eyes occasionally closing, then opening again, always returning to her, always aware. Outside, a car passed somewhere down the street, its distant sound breaking the stillness for a brief second before fading again. And Emily realized how close the world had been, how near ordinary life had continued while something unseen had unfolded within these walls, unnoticed by anyone else. She finished what she could, setting the supplies aside, and sat back on her heels, her gaze resting on Rex as he lay there, no longer just a presence in her home, but something more defined, more understood, even if not fully explained. "I thought I knew what you were," she said quietly, the admission soft, almost lost in the room, and Rex blinked slowly, his head lowering, fully to the floor now, his body finally allowing itself to rest. Emily remained there for a moment longer, letting the silence settle again. But this time it did not feel like something to fear. It felt like something to respect, something that held the echo of a choice made without witness, a moment where instinct had drawn a line and held it. And as the last of the daylight faded from the windows, she understood that whatever had crossed into her home had not left because it chose to, but because something had stood in its way and refused to move. The evening settled in quietly, the kind of slow descent where the light does not disappear all at once but fades in layers, leaving the house wrapped in a soft dimness that felt almost protective. And Emily moved through it with a steadiness she had not known earlier, her steps quieter now, more intentional, as if she had learned something in the silence and did not want to disturb it. She turned on a single lamp near the living room, its warm glow stretching across the floor and catching the edges of the hallway where Rex still lay, his body finally at rest, though not entirely at ease, as if some part of him remained alert even in exhaustion. And she watched him for a moment before walking to the kitchen, pouring a glass of water she did not realize she needed until she took the first sip and felt her throat loosen. The world outside continued as it always did, a distant car passing, a faint voice somewhere down the street, ordinary sounds that now felt strangely separate from what had happened inside these walls. As though the house had held something the outside world would never fully see, she leaned against the counter, her eyes drifting back to Rex. And for the first time since she had known him, she did not see just a dog that had been brought into her home out of obligation or trust borrowed from someone else. She saw something else entirely, something shaped by moments she had not lived, choices she had not witnessed, instincts she had not understood, and that realization settled into her with a quiet weight. "Daniel said you were different," she murmured, the name coming back to her now with a clarity it had not carried before, the memory of a conversation she had once brushed aside, something about training, about instinct, about how some dogs did not just follow commands, they made decisions, and at the time it had sounded like pride, like exaggeration, like something people said to give meaning to things they could not explain. But now, standing here, looking at Rex as he lay between the hallway and the nursery, she began to understand that it had never been about exaggeration at all. She walked back toward him, slower this time, and sat down a few feet away, not close enough to crowd him, but not distant either. And for a while she simply watched the rise and fall of his chest, the steady rhythm returning, the tension easing further with each breath. And in that quiet observation, she found herself thinking about the moment she had first seen him, the way fear had filled her before thought could catch up, the way she had assumed the worst without knowing anything at all. And the realization of that hit her now, not as guilt, but as something heavier, something that required acknowledgement. "I was wrong," she said softly, the words barely louder than a breath, and Rex's ear flicked slightly at the sound, though he did not lift his head, did not need to, because something in the tone carried more than the words themselves. From the nursery came a small stir, a soft shift in Noah's sleep, and Emily turned her head instinctively, listening, always listening now. And when the quiet returned just as gently, she exhaled slowly, the tension that had once lived in her chest now replaced by something steadier, something grounded. She looked back at Rex again, and this time, She noticed something she had not allowed herself to see before. Not just the strength in him, not just the training or the discipline, but the patience, the way he had endured her distance, her doubt, her hesitation, and still remained, still watched, still chose to stay. The clock on the wall ticked forward, marking time in small, steady increments, and Emily realized how different those moments felt now. Not rushed, not anxious, but measured, each second carrying the quiet understanding that something important had already happened, something that did not need noise or recognition to matter. She stood slowly and walked back to the nursery once more, stepping inside and placing her hand gently on the edge of the crib, her eyes resting on Noah's peaceful face. And for a long moment, she simply stood there, letting the stillness settle into her, letting the truth take shape not in words but in feeling. The knowledge that the space between fear and safety had been held by something she had almost misunderstood. When she returned to the hallway, Rex had shifted slightly, his head now resting more comfortably against the floor, his body no longer braced, and Emily paused beside him, lowering herself carefully and placing her hand once more on his shoulder, this time without hesitation, without doubt, just a quiet presence shared between them. "You kept him safe," she whispered, not as a question, not as a guess, but as something she finally allowed herself to believe, and in that moment, the house no longer felt like a place where something had gone wrong. It felt like a place where something had been held together, quietly, without witness, by a choice that had been made, without needing to be seen. The night settled fully now, wrapping the house in a quiet darkness that felt deeper than usual, not empty, but watchful, as if the walls themselves had learned something and were holding it close. And Emily moved through the dim light with a calm she had not expected to find again so soon, her hand trailing lightly along the edge of the hallway as she passed, grounding herself in the familiar shape of home that now carried a new weight. She paused by the window, looking out into the street, where porch lights flickered on one by one, each house returning to its own rhythm, unaware of how close something unseen had come to crossing a line that could not be undone. And for a moment she simply stood there, letting the quiet settle around her, letting the truth continue to unfold not in loud revelations, but in small, steady realizations that came with each breath. Behind her, Rex shifted again, a soft movement against the floor, and when she turned, she saw him lifting his head, slightly, his eyes following her not with urgency, but with awareness, as if even now, even in rest, he remained connected to every movement she made, every sound that touched the air. She walked back to him slowly and knelt beside him once more, her presence no longer hesitant, no longer uncertain, and when she placed her hand against his side, she felt it clearly now, the warmth, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the quiet strength that remained even after whatever had taken place earlier. And beneath that, something else, something that felt like exhaustion carried with purpose, not defeat, but completion. "You can rest now," she whispered, her voice low and certain, and Rex's eyes closed for a longer moment this time, his body easing further into the floor as if the permission mattered, as if he had been waiting not for safety, but for acknowledgement. From the nursery came another soft sound, a gentle shift, and Emily rose instinctively, moving toward it with a quiet urgency that no longer felt driven by fear, but by care. And when she entered, she found Noah stirring lightly, his small hands moving against the blanket, his breathing still calm, still steady, and she leaned over, placing her hand gently against his chest, feeling the rise and fall beneath her palm, grounding herself once more in the simple, undeniable truth that he was safe. She adjusted the blanket, smoothing it gently, and for a moment she simply stayed there, watching him, memorizing the quiet details of his face in the soft glow of the night light, the way his lips parted slightly with each breath, the way his brow relaxed in sleep, untouched by anything that had nearly reached him. When she stepped back into the hallway, Rex had not moved far, but his position had shifted just enough that he faced the nursery more directly, his body still angled in that same silent guard. And Emily noticed it again, the instinct that had not faded, the quiet vigilance that did not need command, and she understood then that this was not something that turned on and off, not something that ended when the moment passed. It was something that lived within him, something that had been shaped long before he ever came into her home. She walked to the phone on the counter, her hand hovering over it for a moment, the thought crossing her mind that she should call someone, report something, explain something she could not fully describe, and yet she hesitated, not because she wanted to ignore what had happened, but because she realized that whatever she said would never fully capture the truth of it. The quiet decision that had been made in her absence, the line that had been held without witness. She picked up the phone anyway, dialing slowly, her voice calm when someone answered, explaining only what she could, that something had been wrong, that the back door had been left open, that there were signs she did not understand, and as she spoke, her eyes drifted back to Rex, who remained where he was, silent, steady, present. When she hung up, the house felt different again, not uncertain, but acknowledged, as if speaking even part of the truth had shifted. Something in the air, and she returned to Rex, lowering herself beside him once more, her hand resting gently against his shoulder, not checking, not cleaning, just being there. "I did not see it," she said. Quietly, her voice steady, "But I know you did." And Rex opened his eyes, meeting hers with that same steady gaze. No need for explanation, no need for recognition beyond what was already understood between them. The night deepened outside, the sounds of the neighborhood fading into a distant hum, and inside the house, the quiet held firm, no longer fragile, no longer uncertain, but grounded in something that had already been decided, something that did not need to be proven to exist. And as Emily sat there beside him, her hand resting against his side, she realized that some moments do not arrive with noise or witnesses or clear explanations. Some moments pass in silence, leaving behind only what matters most. And in that silence, a life had been protected, not by chance, but by a choice that had been made without hesitation. The sound of distant sirens began as a faint thread in the night, barely noticeable at first, blending into the quiet hum of the neighborhood, but slowly it grew, not urgent, not chaotic, just steady, approaching with a calm that matched the stillness inside the house. And Emily heard it from where she sat beside Rex, her hand resting lightly against his side, her thoughts no longer racing but settling into something clearer, something grounded. She did not move right away, did not rush to the window or the door, because for the first time since everything had unfolded, she did not feel like she was chasing answers. She felt like she already held the most important one. Even if the details had yet to fully surface, Rex remained still beneath her hand, his breathing even now, his body finally allowing itself to rest in a way that suggested whatever vigilance had carried him through the earlier hours had begun to fade, not because the world was suddenly safe, but because his role in that moment had been fulfilled. The sirens grew closer, then softened as they turned onto the street, their presence no longer distant, and Emily slowly rose, her movements unhurried, her eyes drifting once more toward the nursery before she walked to the front window and pulled the curtain back just enough to see the flashing lights reflecting off the quiet houses across the road, blue and red painting the night in brief pulses that felt almost unreal compared to the steady calm she had found inside. A patrol car rolled to a stop in front of her home, its engine idling low, and another followed behind it, their presence bringing with it the weight of the outside world finally stepping into what had already happened. And for a moment she simply watched, her hand resting lightly against the glass, her reflection faintly visible over the scene. Outside, a reminder that she was both part of this moment and separate from it. Behind her, Rex shifted slightly, the sound of his movement grounding her again, and she turned, walking back toward him before heading to the door, her hand pausing on the handle as she glanced once more at him, as if asking a silent question, not for permission, but for acknowledgement, and his eyes met hers briefly, steady, calm, unchanged. She opened the door, the cool night air brushing against her face as she stepped onto the porch, the soft creak of the wood beneath her feet echoing faintly, and the officers approached with measured steps, their expressions alert but not alarmed, their presence professional, contained. "Ma'am, we received a call," one of them said, his voice calm, steady, and Emily nodded, her words coming easier than she expected as she explained what she could. The open door, the signs that something had been wrong, the way she had found the house, careful not to speak beyond what she knew. careful not to fill in the spaces that still belonged to the quiet truth she had only begun to understand. They listened, exchanged brief glances, then moved past her with quiet efficiency, stepping into the house with a respect that matched the tone she had set, not rushing, not disrupting more than necessary, and Emily followed a few steps behind, watching as their eyes took in the hallway, the floor, the subtle details that had spoken to her earlier in silence now being read. In a different language, one of procedure and observation. When they reached the back door, one of them paused, studying the frame, the latch, the slight misalignment that had once gone unnoticed, and the other stepped just outside, scanning the porch, the yard, the edges of the space where the world met the boundary of the home, and Emily stood there, her arms folded lightly across herself, not in defense, but in containment, holding the moment together as it unfolded in a way she had already lived through. Rex remained where he was, his body still, his presence quiet but unmistakable, and when one of the officers glanced toward him, their gaze lingered for a brief second, taking in the details, the posture, the subtle signs that something had occurred beyond what words had yet described. And Emily felt a small shift in the room, a recognition not spoken aloud but understood in the way their attention softened just slightly, their movements becoming more measured, more aware. "Is he yours?" the officer asked quietly, and Emily looked at Rex, then back at him, her answer simple, steady, and certain in a way it had not been before. "Yes," she said, and the word carried more than ownership. It carried understanding, acknowledgement, something deeper than the question itself. The officer nodded once, his gaze returning briefly to Rex before shifting back to the task at hand. And as they continued their work, moving through the space, noting what needed to be noted, Emily found herself stepping back, giving them room, not out of distance, but out of trust, because whatever they would find, whatever they would piece together, it would only confirm what she had already come to know in the quiet, that something had entered her home, and something had stood in its way. Outside, the lights continued to pulse softly against the windows, but inside, the house remained steady, grounded in a silence that no longer felt uncertain. And as Emily stood there, watching the world catch up to what had already happened, she realized that some truths do not need to be spoken loudly to be real. They reveal themselves in the spaces between fear and understanding, in the quiet presence of something that chose to stay when it could have turned away, and in that space, everything that mattered had been protected. The house no longer felt like a place waiting for answers, it felt like a place where something had already been decided. And as the officers moved through each room with quiet focus, Emily stood near the edge of the living space, her arms resting loosely at her sides, her gaze drifting between them and Rex, who remained on the floor where he had chosen to stay, his presence steady, unshaken by the unfamiliar footsteps now crossing the space he had already guarded. One of the officers returned from the back door, his expression thoughtful rather than alarmed, and he spoke, in a low voice to his partner, words that Emily could not fully hear but did not need to, because the tone carried enough. It was not confusion, not urgency, but recognition, the kind that comes when pieces begin to align. Another officer stepped closer to the hallway, pausing briefly as he looked toward the nursery, then back at Rex, his eyes lingering just long enough to acknowledge something that did not need explanation. And Emily felt it again, that quiet shift in the room, the way understanding can move through a space without being spoken aloud. "Ma'am," the first officer said as he approached her again, his voice calm, measured. "There are signs someone entered through the back, but it looks like they did not stay." And Emily nodded slowly, her gaze drifting once more toward Rex, because she knew that already, not from evidence, but from presence. "Did you hear anything before you came home?" he asked, and she shook her head gently. "No," she replied, her voice steady. It was quiet, and the word carried more meaning than it usually would, because now she understood that silence does not always mean nothing happened. Sometimes it means something was handled without needing to be heard. The officer glanced once more toward Rex, then back to her. "Your dog," he said, not as a question, but as an observation, and Emily followed his gaze, her eyes resting on Rex's still form, the way his body remained angled toward the nursery even now, even with others present. And something in her chest settled deeper. "He stayed with the baby," she said quietly. And though the officer did not respond immediately, the brief pause that followed felt like acknowledgement, like something understood without needing further detail. Another officer stepped in from outside, giving a small nod, confirming something unspoken, and the pieces of the moment seemed to settle into place not with noise, but with quiet clarity, the kind that does not need to be explained to be real. Emily felt the weight of it then, not as fear, not as relief, but as something steadier, something that held both. The understanding that what had happened inside her home would never be fully seen the way it had truly occurred, but that did not make it any less real. The officers continued their work, moving with a quiet efficiency that respected the space rather than disrupted it, and Emily found herself stepping back toward the hallway again, her attention returning to Rex, who had not shifted, not reacted, not sought attention, just remained, as if his role in this moment had already ended long before anyone else arrived. She knelt beside him once more, her hand resting gently against his side, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. And this time there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just presence, just understanding. "They know," she whispered softly, though she was not entirely sure who she meant, the officers, herself, or something beyond both, and Rex's ear flicked slightly at the sound of her voice, a small acknowledgement that felt enough. The flashing lights outside softened as one of the patrol cars shut off its engine, the night returning gradually to its natural rhythm, and inside, the house held on to its quiet, no longer fragile, no longer uncertain, but grounded in something that had already been proven without needing to be seen. One of the officers approached again, his tone respectful, his words simple, explaining that they would file a report, that they would check the area, that they would follow what they could, and Emily listened, nodding when appropriate. But her focus no longer rested on what might come next, it rested on what had already been held together before any of them arrived. When the officers finally began to step out, their presence easing back into the night they had come from, the door remained open for a moment. Longer, letting in the cool air, the distant sounds, the ordinary world that continued on, and Emily stood there, watching them go, not with relief, but with a quiet acceptance that some moments do not belong to explanation. They belong to what remains after. She closed the door gently, the soft click of the latch settling into the space like a final note, and when she turned back, the house felt whole again, not untouched, but held. And Rex remained there, exactly where he had been, his presence no longer something she questioned, but something she understood in a way that did not need words. She walked back to him slowly and sat beside him once more, her hand finding its place against his shoulder as naturally as if it had always belonged there. And in that quiet moment, with the world outside fading back into distance and the house settling into its own rhythm, she realized that some truths do not arrive through what is said or proven, they arrive through what is protected. And in this house, something had been protected in silence, by a choice that had already been made before anyone else ever knew there was a reason to choose. The house grew still again after the door closed, not the kind of stillness that feels empty, but the kind that settles in after something important has passed, like the final note of a song that lingers long after the sound is gone. And Emily stood there for a moment, her hand still resting against the door, feeling the quiet press gently around her, no longer heavy, no longer uncertain, but complete. She turned slowly, her eyes finding Rex where he lay, his body finally at ease in a way it had not been before, his breathing steady, his presence calm, and for a long second she simply looked at him, not searching, not questioning, just seeing him fully, perhaps for the first time since he had entered her life. The hallway light cast a soft glow across the floor, catching the edges of his fur, and the dark stains that had once filled her with fear now felt different, no longer symbols of something wrong, but quiet evidence of something that had been held back, something that had been stopped before it could reach what mattered most. She walked toward him slowly and knelt beside him, her movements natural now, unguarded, and when she placed her hand against his shoulder, he did not flinch, did not hesitate. He simply remained, his eyes opening briefly to meet hers before closing again, as if the need to stay alert had finally passed. "It is over," she whispered, though the words were not just for him. They were for herself, for the moment, for the fear that had once filled the space between them. From the nursery came the soft, steady rhythm of Noah's breathing, unchanged, untouched, and Emily felt it again. That quiet surge of gratitude that did not need to be spoken aloud to be real, the kind that settles deep and stays there. She rose gently and walked to the nursery once more, pushing the door open just enough to see him, her son sleeping peacefully, unaware of how close the world had come, unaware of the line that had been drawn and held without his knowing. And she stood there longer this time, letting the sight of him anchor everything that had happened into something simple and clear. He was safe, and that was enough. When she returned to the hallway, Rex had shifted slightly, his body stretched out more fully now, the tension gone, replaced by a quiet rest that felt earned, and Emily sat beside him again, not out of necessity, but out of choice, her hand resting gently against his side, as if it had always belonged there. The night deepened outside, the distant sounds fading into a quiet hum. And inside, the house held its calm, no longer waiting, no longer uncertain, but settled, grounded in something that had already been proven without needing to be seen. Emily leaned back against the wall, her eyes drifting between Rex and the nursery, and in that quiet space, she thought about how easily she had misunderstood, how quickly fear had shaped her first instinct, and how different the truth had been, not loud, not dramatic, but steady, silent, and certain. "You did not have to," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you did." And the words carried a weight that went beyond the moment, beyond the house, beyond anything that could be written in a report or explained in a statement. Rex's tail moved once against the floor, a small, tired motion, and though he did not lift his head, something in that simple gesture felt like an answer, not one that needed to be understood, but one that simply existed. Time passed without measure, the minutes blending into the quiet, and Emily found herself no longer thinking about what might have happened, no longer trying to fill in the gaps. Because the gaps did not matter, what mattered was what remained, what had been protected, what had been kept safe through a choice made in silence. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the stillness settle deeper, and when she opened them again, nothing had changed, and yet everything had, because now she saw it. Not just the dog beside her, but the meaning of what he had done, not as an act that needed recognition, but as something that simply was, something that did not ask to be seen, only to be understood. She reached down and rested her hand more firmly against him, her fingers pressing gently into his fur, grounding herself in the quiet truth of his presence. And for the first time, there was no distance between them, no hesitation, no doubt, just a shared stillness that held everything that had passed without needing to speak it. The house remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of something kept, something preserved, something that had been chosen and held in place when it mattered most. And as Emily sat there beside him, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing and the soft breath of her child down the hall, she understood that some acts do not need witnesses, some moments do not need explanation. They live in the quiet space between what could have been and what was allowed to remain. And in that space, everything that mattered had been protected by a choice that did not ask to be seen, only to be made.